So I've been thinking about this concept of reaction of individuals is really what the whole premise is. But it's like this idea of how each individual is, but then how interacting with others also affects us. So I've been using the analogy of the marbles. Like, you know, people that played this when they were little maybe recognize marbles. Oh yeah, that's that game where you take the marbles and you flick them at each other, and like you try to either miss marbles and leave as many on the board as possible, or shoot the marbles out of the ring. But there's also these ball bearing games that, like, they're those little plastic things that you got real cheap, and there's little BBs in them, and then there's little divots in the cartoon backboard that you gotta roll it around and then get the marbles, the little BBs, ball bearings, to stick in the little holes. And then there's also the tilt marble mazes. So you put the marbles in and you got to get them around certain holes, but you got to make it all the way through the maze to the last hole. So I've been looking at those games, marbles and BBs and ball bearings, pellets, whatever you want to call them. So here's these marbles, and each individual person is represented by one of these marbles. So some of these marbles are different sizes, different shapes, different colors. Some have chips out of them, some have really rough edges, some are super smooth, so, and some are like a more dense glass or a metal or whatever have you, different materials, right? So here's all these different marbles, BBs, things like that. So this represents people in general. So I equate this to teaching in the classroom, right? So each one of my students is this some type of spherical object, and they are all put on the same surface, being Earth, or the classroom more specifically. So the trick of the teacher or each individual is to figure out, number one, what is this spherical object before me, right? This three-dimensional object, this human. And you have to measure these things and figure out what these things are and what they are capable of and how they react and whatnot. So speaking with the analogy or the metaphor, each BB spherical thing is a little bit different. So let's take the big ones. You know, these are the big marbles, and these things, they got a lot of surface area, so they can roll over a lot of things. So if there's bumps in the ground or anything like that, they just roll right over it. And to make one of these things change their direction is really difficult, because you really got to use a lot of force because they're so big. And depending on the material per se, or the surface of it, sometimes they're rough, so they can really go over some big things and not get any damage. But if it's real polished, then like hitting stuff will damage the surface of this. And hitting certain things, like if you're a metal ball bearing and you are going in a trajectory, there's little that's going to stop you, and anything that you hit is going to get out of the way or crumble. But if it's a real fine glass or some other material that's really fragile, then when it hits anything, then it's always kind of in this area of like, ouch, you know, this thing's hurting me, this is causing me to be upset, this is disrupting me. And so you take that as opposed to like little BBs. So like anything they hit, they're pinging out of the way. Like if they hit a little bump or a little ridge, they're gonna stop and go backwards. So these little BBs are really hard to keep it in the same direction, and anything gets in their way. And then you've got like the third position, right? So you've got the immovable force versus the ones that are most affected. But then you've got the ones that have cracks in them or look one way, but then maybe they're chipped on the back, or these ones that you can kind of get a read, but something's messed up. They are not whole, literally and figuratively. And so these equate to the kids with trauma, the things that are disrupting their life. Maybe they're made out of firm, heavy stuff, but they've got a crack in them, and if something hits that crack, a big piece chips off, metaphorically speaking, or in literal senses. It's a kid who's got this severe trauma, and they're rough and they're like real solid, but then certain things can tip them off kilter, or maybe they've got chips all over, so they're constantly like fragile in like different areas and what have you. So these become the spheres become the metaphor for the individual. Now take those individuals and you want to set them on a path, right? So that's the job of the teacher, is like, I need to figure out what you are and figure out what path is best for you. Like, I'm going to read you as an individual. So if you're a little BB, you can't have all these things in front of you. You need a pretty clear path, but it doesn't need to be a big path. Whereas like the big ball bearings, when you flick them, you gotta have a wide berth, because like whatever way they're going. But they can roll over almost anything, so they can put up with a lot. So you're measuring these kids, these students, these other people in your life, and they're like they're like these ball bearings as individuals. Now here's the thing. Now put those ball bearings in a situation where they have to come in contact. Like they're all in the same spot. So you got the big ball bearings that are one trajectory with all these little ball bearings that can fling off at any given time. And like if they're weak and fragile little guys, they are going to be smushed. They are just shrapnel. And so this becomes the classroom, right? And so you need to figure out how all these ball bearings ping off of each other. They bounce around. They're just doing all this other stuff. So now we've got all these spherical objects all in the same area, and you've got one person, hi teacher, that's me, trying to figure out each one of these individuals, but then you've got them in a box. They're all in the same place. So you got these kids that react different ways than these kids, and you're trying to figure out all their paths, but you have to congregate them. You have to make them into a community. You have a social microcosm. So you're trying to direct all what works best for all these kids. Yeah. You want us to figure out what is going to be best for all these kids in this box that are completely different from each other? Great. Yeah. Thanks. Cool. So here's the situation. Now, that's just like the two-dimensional. Now you got the third dimension, right? So the third dimension is environment. And this can be their environments at home, their town, the people around them, their family members, their friends, the school. Like, all this is now the third dimension of like, where is this sucker going? So we've got this kid's going this way. You've got the classroom environment, which is leading all the kids in this way. But then you've got this third dimension where you're thinking about all the things that affected these kids on any given day and their whole life, So you're dealing with the physical, mental, social, emotional, and spiritual levels. That's 5 different dimensions that we are dealing with as individuals, and then you put them in a group. and now they're pinging off of each other. And you need to learn very quickly who pings off of who. And then you need to get them all in a direction. And these directions are not the same. That's the misgiving as well. So you got all these things happening between these kids, all these different directions they're flying, and you're trying to teach them something. And if you are doing it right, I would argue as a teacher, all these kids come in essentially telling you the direction that they want to go, what they're best. If you pay attention, if you know how to read a kid or another person, this works in all social situations. Like, you're measuring the individual, you're measuring the individuals around them, you're measuring the trajectory of that being, because they'll tell you, like, if you listen, they're explaining to you just by their way of being what they need to do in this world. But you need to get them to listen too. So that's the job of the teacher as well. So here's this concept. These are the things that I have learned. Let me gift them to you. But you don't want them just straightforward. They need to be applicable to you. You need to plug that information in so that it makes sense. So that's the job of the teacher. So before this all begins, the teacher needs to know their subject area. They need to have a passion for it and know how to not only do it, but to tell other people how to do it as well. So it's one thing to just do it yourself, because you've decoded all this information, but now you gotta decode it, then encode it for each individual. And they decode different than we encode. So you need to make all these manipulations. You need to just keep saying in a million different ways, much like I'm doing right now. I understand the irony. I'm a teacher. So, this becomes the challenge, is learn the information. You got to decode what you know, encode it so that the kids can understand it, but you need to decode how they encode. So you need to change that. So there's all this decoding and encoding, like interpretations and communications. And so we're expected to do this on a topic area, subject area. So I'm an art teacher, I teach art. But then you need to figure out how this applies. Why does this matter? And what is the best thing for the student? And so not only do the little personalities get in the way of you trying to teach them, but you got to deal with everything that is going on in your mind, your values, your morals, and everything like that. And you need to communicate it in a way that kids can make choices. Otherwise, you are literally being didactic. You are telling them what to think. And that's a hard thing to do, because me as a teacher, I obviously have strong beliefs in certain things. So when a student is living a style of life that I don't personally agree with, you still need to make choices of, all right, is this a matter of the kid dealing with the rest of society? And is it okay for me to tell them, hey, this is why you're doing this wrong. You need to consider this with respect to yourself. But then I also have to consider, is this against my bias? So I'm the hand that can pick up the marbles and shoot them in the different directions. But I need to know what that kid's path is so I can send them in that direction. And I need to be cognizant of all the other marbles in which way they're flinging. So it's like clearing a path in all these different directions and giving them what they need to be independent in their life without putting in my biases or any other biases that there may be. So this is the marbles that are going around, and this is the things that must be considered as a teacher. And ultimately, here's the thing. I'm preparing kids for society. And the way that society is acting generally right now is insane. Like, if you ask the general person what they think about society, they understand that it's some kind of mess. We might not agree what type of mess it is, but it's a mess. I think that's something that can be agreed upon. So the question is not what all our differences of beliefs are, but what do we need to believe in? And what then do we as teachers aim to teach? What's the big idea? And my interpretation of this is teaching independence, teaching the marbles to recognize what those other marbles are so that they don't get smushed by them, they don't end up with the wrong marbles, they don't let the wrong marbles affect them, and they can still get to their end goal. So teaching independence becomes the major factor of education, to teach people that I don't need you. I can do this by myself, and myself, I am not going to get in the way of anybody else. I'm going to do my thing. But that's where I would argue the messes of society is that for whatever reason, it has become the focus of each individual nuance of people's lives. We are focusing too small people. Like the government, the nation of the world, like the American, I gotta talk about the U.S. because that's all I know, and I live in Wisconsin, so that's all I know. So this literally gets to the point. We're letting all these big issues that are not big issues, they're personal issues, become the big issues. We're focusing too small and we're blowing it up too big. It's like the old saying goes, you're making a mountain out of a molehill. And yeah, they're important, but guess what? It matters to the people that are around you, the people that you come in contact. So if they're acting different than you like, then you need to figure out what it is about those people that you don't like. Is it really the whole person, or are you saying it's because of who they voted for, or what their perception of whose relationship should be what? So this becomes the concern, and everybody's trying to run everybody else's lives. That's not independence. That is literally stepping into dependency. You believe that you get to make all the decisions for everyone, while arguing the hypocrisy of everyone gets to be heard and live their own lives. So the moment that you step into an arena where you're saying that marble needs to roll that way because that coincides with my life, sorry, that's not how it works. Like, if you're a little BB, you're telling that big ball bearing that they need to stop moving in that direction, you're missing the point. So it all becomes a question of who are you worried about? And the people that you worry about should not be out of dislike, hate, disagreement, difference, whatever. It should be because you're focusing on those things. You're not focusing on ones you love. You want the perception of somebody that is not in your circle. They're not on your team. They're not playing your game, whatever metaphor, analogy you need. They're different than you. And we have just hit 8 billion people on the planet. So there's going to be some people with some differences. And for all the reasons that I've just discussed with the marble analogy. So if we're teaching people, that's what we need to be teaching right now. Not how to assume a job, because we'll give them the basic information, but most jobs, when you go into them, they teach you exactly what they want you. So the myth of the school preparing for a job is irrelevant. Like, you're testing, like, you need to get the kids on that path to understanding what they are as their individual marbles before they can go out in the world and make good choices. Don't believe me? Look in any classroom with a misbehaving kid. That kid hasn't figured out their self yet. And the education, the people around them, their environments have not put them on the right track yet. So that becomes the art lesson. What are you? What can you do? What trajectory are you on? Okay, here's how you get there. Here's the progression. You need to learn these steps. You need to learn the medias and the techniques and the subject matter so that you can be part of the world. Ba-ba! So, that's the marble analogy. Thank you for your time and your attention. Do more, do better.